everyone, my name is Beth Gilligan from the Coolidge Corner Theater. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this special Science on Screen Q&A for the film Radium Girls. We are thrilled to be here with the filmmakers, Lydia Dean Pilcher and Ginny Mohler, also with Dr. Richard Clapp, who's going to speak a bit more about the science behind the film. But before we get started, just a few intro comments. This film is streaming right now at coolidge.org or at your local art house. I know some of our Science on Screen grantee theaters may be tuned in. Every time you stream one of our films, it does support us during this time. Our doors have been closed for over, I think, 8 months now, which is kind of crazy. So we're really, as an independent nonprofit cinema, we're so grateful for your support. We love the opportunity for you to see our films. We do still curate them as carefully as we did back when we were open, and to have these conversations. So thanks to everyone for tuning in, for your support. Thank you to the sponsors of this series, particularly the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Their support has allowed us to expand Science on Screen to 86 art house cinemas nationwide over the past decade. So this is a series that began here at the Coolidge in 2005. And now we are everywhere from Juneau, Alaska to Honolulu, where we'd all love to be right now, Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, Nashville, Tennessee, Queens, all over the country. And we're just so grateful to have this great network of grantees, and to Doran Weber, who's the VP of Programs at Sloan, for his ongoing support. Also, thanks to Ruben Anders Scientific, to Ellen Hoffman and Ken Loveday for supporting the series here in Brookline, and to our series founder, Richard Anders, and finally also to Elizabeth Sheldon from Juno Films for making this event possible. If you have questions that come up, please feel free to drop them in the YouTube chat. There's somebody there, they'll be passing them along to me. I'm happy to pass them along to the panelists as time permits. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Lydia Dean Pilcher has produced over 35 feature films. Her most recent credits include Queen of Katwe and The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. She's a 2-time Emmy Award winner and was nominated for an Oscar for Cutie The Boxer. And she's produced films for directors ranging from Kathryn Bigelow to Wes Anderson, to Wang, to 11 films in a 25-year collaboration with Mira Nair, who's an extraordinary filmmaker. Ginny Mohler is a Brooklyn-based writer and director. Radium Girls is her debut feature film, and her work as a writer, producer, and researcher in nonfiction television has fueled her passion for untold history and her commitment to telling stories of women who fight back. And we definitely have that here. And we also have an epidemiologist with more than 40 years experience in public health practice, teaching and consulting. Dr. Richard Clapp is an emeritus professor of environmental health at Boston University School of Public Health and an adjunct professor at UMass Lowell. His research projects at the latter focus on analyzing data related to environmental and occupational causes of cancer and other diseases. He served as director of the Massachusetts Cancer Registry from 1980 to 1989 and former co-chair of Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility. And as I said, this film, if you haven't seen it already, I expect many of you on the Q&A have, please spread the word. The New York Times called it a worthy entry in the category of women's rights movies. It compared it to Silkwood. And talked about how the filmmakers reveal a little known part of history with a loudly beating feminist heart and a narrative grounded in reality. And I thought that was a terrific way of summing up this excellent film. So I just wanted to start at the beginning. This was a story that, in watching the film, I felt like I should have heard of this, but for whatever reason, I hadn't. So I wanted to start with Ginny. You co-wrote the film with Brittany Shaw. Can you tell me about sort of how had you known about the story for a long time? How did you happen upon it, and how did the film begin to come together?
I had that same feeling when I learned about the story. I couldn't believe that I had never heard about it before. It was back in 2012. I was working as an archival researcher at a small documentary production company, and I was assigned a project about the Manhattan Project and building the atomic bomb. And as I was doing research, I stumbled across this very cryptic sentence that said, "We all remembered the tragic dial painters of World War I." And I read it. I think I did a double take, and I just didn't know. I didn't remember, and I didn't know what tragedy. I didn't know what a dial painter was. And so I Googled that phrase, and I found the Wikipedia page called The Radium Girls. And I read the story, and I turned to my coworker, Brittany Shaw. We were friends from film school, and we both said, how have we never heard this story before? And how is this not yet a movie? And that's when we started writing the movie.
Excellent. And Lydia, so as noted earlier, you've had an amazing career as a producer. As I understand it, this is your feature film directorial debut. At what point did you get involved with the project, and what inspired you to step behind the camera for this?
Well, I had been working in the realm of environmental activism for many years, and even within our own entertainment industry, had been a co-founder of the Producers Guild of America Environmental Committee. We have a long relationship with the studio partners in Hollywood. But I had been looking for a project where I could blend my passion for the environment with my storytelling career, my narrative storytelling career. And I was really just put the word out to look for a project. And a friend that I have in common with Ginny sort of connected the dots that Ginny had just written a script that was really interesting about this very little known story. And I called her up, I read it, and I was immediately in because I was captivated by this story that was told through the eyes of teenage girls. It was, it was these girls who were painting glow in the dark watch dials in Orange, New Jersey at a time when they had big dreams. One wanted to go to Egypt and be an archaeologist. One wanted to go to Hollywood and be a movie star. And they were working class girls who were just waiting for their big moment when all of a sudden this whole rude awakening happens in the place where they're working. And it was a real coming of age story in that sense. And I loved the idea that you could follow this character with these other women going through the same thing in this real world. And it was a vibrant real world with a lot of different things happening as we tried to show in our world building elements in the film.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was one of the cool things I thought was the archival footage, how you weave that in. Can you talk about, I know you've done some historical research with documentaries, Ginny, was that sort of an inspiration to you to bring that into the film?
I think that definitely affected it. The year and a half in which Brittany and I were writing the first draft of the Radium Girls screenplay, by day we were digging through archival material, much of it digitized. There's some incredible archives online, specialty collections too, that have been digitized. And so I was working on a 2-hour special for the Discovery Channel about the atomic bomb. So I was going through material that was about radioactivity and a lot of the history there. And then she was working on a 2-hour special about the civil rights movement. And so she was going through footage that included 1920s in terms of like civil rights, and we were just exposed to the worlds within the worlds within the worlds that existed in the images already, and so that was definitely in mind as we were writing the script.
Yeah, and so the characters in the film, because immediately after I Googled, I was like, is there a real life Bessie? But it seems like, so she and her sisters were composite based on reality, but then there were some characters, Dr. Catherine Drinker, for instance, who are real life people. How did you weave that all together? And, what was the process behind coming up with those characters and intermingling the real and the fictional?
Well, the place that we interwove the most is within the girls, because Bessie and Joe, I think the more that we read about the real women and girls who were going through this, that was the space, as Lydia was saying, is this film about teenage girls and the dreams of teenage girls, and wanting to both really honor the true experience of the women, but also feel like we could develop this creative world for them. And so, but then, the facts of the story are certainly more dramatic, I think, than anything we could imagine. And so that is where the real players of, the factory owner and some of the doctors and someone like Catherine Drinker come in as who they really were and what they really did.
And before we switch into shift gears into the sort of more of the science and the facts, I just have to ask, the cast is amazing. Joey King is the lead, but also so many of the supporting actors. How did that casting process work? How did you know you had your Bessie and your Joe and some of the other characters?
Well, we were guided by the script, which was as Ginny was saying, some of the characters were composites of real characters and things that we knew about real characters, and then other characters were just straight up real. Arthur Roeder, the head of the corporation, Dr. Flint, Dr. Marlin, Catherine Wiley, all of these were real people that we just took directly from who they were and tried to have our casting sort of guide by the inspiration of those characters. But Bessie was inspired by some diaries that were left behind by Kathryn Shaw, who was one of the Radium Girls, and she had this very imaginative personality. She had this kind of bubbly spark to her, and you could tell that from her writing. And so that informed the way that Brittany and Ginny wrote the character. And obviously when we went out to cast that part, we were looking for somebody that could convey that energy. And Joey just seemed like the perfect idea. So we were thrilled when she wanted to do it. And her sister, the actress who plays her sister, Josephine, is Abby Quinn, who is actually grew up in Boston. I had tried to cast her in a teen girl movie, and the casting director called me back and said, she's in high school and her mother's not going to let her come to New York and do a movie, but she's going to be a star. I'm pretty sure of it. You should just put her in the Sisterhood of Night. You won't regret it. And so that was some years ago. We cast her, and the casting director was right. Every time you cut to her on screen, you just felt this presence. So we were excited to go to her with the character of Jo, and she was really thrilled to play it. And Joey and Abby, just had a beautiful chemistry on screen and off screen. They really loved each other, and have been good friends since then. So that was very serendipitous. But it all came from sort of casting from this, from this place of the character we were trying to convey. And we had a lot of great New York stage actors in the movie, which was wonderful because they could just hop. We shot up in Lake George, New York, and they could hop on the train and come up and be with us for a few days and then go back to New York. So it all worked out really well.
Yeah, it's a wonderful cast, absolutely. So Dr. Clapp, this was a story that was new to me, probably new to many viewers. I'm guessing not so new in the field of environmental health. Can you talk about how this story is sort of informed and continue to inform the understanding of the field? I know when we spoke earlier, you mentioned sort of a local angle, local to Massachusetts. Can you give us a little bit of background on that?
Sure. I mean, it wasn't new. The story wasn't new to me because I was involved in radiation research 40 years ago, 35 years ago. And in particular, we were looking at, this was a interagency funded epidemiologic feasibility study to see if there were people who were exposed to radiation, primarily at work, who had not yet been studied, so that you could, do additional new information about especially low-level exposures and how they affected people's health. So we were going around, searching around the archives, as Ginny said, and actually we had a person who was an advisor to this project. This was 1979, who was one of the first people to study and publish about the Radium Girls. His name was Tony Polednak, and one of the first, mortality studies of what these women died of was by him, published in the 1970s. And so that got us into this topic of radium dial painters and how that particular exposure worked. By the 1970s, it had already been well established that it caused bone cancer, and then probably some other types of cancer, nasal cancer, and some others as well. So I unfortunately knew about this, and it was, one of these apocryphal, sad stories, not even apocryphal. It was a real story that the people who were interested in the effects of radiation knew about from the early part of this century. The very first studies were not really epidemiologic studies. They were what we call case series. So they were a listing of the people who worked at the Orange plant, the US Radium Corporation plant, but not comparing them to, say, other young women who didn't work there, or the type of thing that epidemiologic studies usually do. That was done later. And that, it was a clear-cut case of industrial poisoning. And so, yeah, and it was not just in plants in New Jersey. There was a plant here in Massachusetts in Waltham where they were doing the same thing, radium dial painting for either clocks or watches, or actually both, I think. And we found out that when I was doing this feasibility study, that there were records kept in, I believe it was Lexington, Massachusetts, about those employees. And so it could have been the basis for a follow-up study of what happens to women in Waltham. And it turned out we chose not to do that or recommend that study because it had already been done and the evidence was already in. I would say another thing about this movie, which I loved. The movie is brilliant. I understand the book is brilliant too, and I need to go read the book now. But the legal case that was brought, and as you know from the movie, it was a kind of young, inexperienced lawyer who was willing to take on this corporation, and people told him and the women, "You'll never win." And he said, "Oh yes, we will. All we got to do is show what the company knew, and that they kept exposing these women to things that they knew were harmful." Well, that's usually a really uphill battle. And so the fact that they did it and, well, they get at least a settlement, it didn't actually go to a verdict, but the women themselves got pretty generous settlement for the time, at least. And that became a bellwether for future health studies or health-based claims against polluting corporations that have continued to the present day. In fact, I'm sure there are some going on right now. Some of us were talking about perfluorinated compounds, and there are lawsuits against companies like DuPont and 3M, where they have epidemiologic study and individual cases that are brought before juries in court, and they win. So all of that is part of a continuum. It's pretty depressing when you think about the human cost that it's taking. But this movie and this story is really instructive.
Absolutely. And I think, there are so many things I think in the story that continue to resonate because, even just the fact that they're popularly known as the Radium Girls, these are young working class women whose claims are being ignored and dismissed by a large corporation. You have, suppression of data. You have these experts who, are making these wild claims and completely skewing the data. You touched upon this a little bit, Dr. Clapp, but it just, I'm wondering, in terms of the film's relevance today, especially in light of what we've seen happening at the EPA over the past 4 years with the current administration. Are the Radium Girls, is there a current day Radium Girls situation going on, or
Well, yeah. I mean, I mentioned perfluorinated compounds. That's one, and the people who worked at the DuPont plant in Parkersburg, West Virginia, it was men and women, and in fact, birth defects was one of the findings of the women who were working with perfluorinated or perfluorooctanoic acid, it's called PFOA, were having babies with eye defects. And so that wasn't that long ago. I would also say that and this is a very strong aspect of the film, there's social movements that propel these stories. There certainly was in response to the Radium Girls, strong social support from political organizations in New Jersey. And similarly, there has been strong social support for people now who are taking on 3M or DuPont around PFOA or PFOS, the two chemicals that those two companies made, that are also propelled by active citizens groups working in their communities all across this country. So that's a continuum as well. It's social activism and social movements that push this stuff and actually build support for people who are out front taking courageous stands, as was depicted in the movie.
Yeah, Lydia and Ginny, can you elaborate on that a little bit about, because you have these figures from the early, the women's political movement. Can you talk a little bit about them and how they inspired this and put a spotlight on the Radium Girls?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting that where the case really broke was a woman in the New Jersey Health Department seeing reports of sick workers coming across her desk, and somehow it didn't add up that they were all, getting sick from syphilis and then dying. And so this woman took the reports and went to Kathryn Wiley of the New Jersey Consumers League, and she was kind of aware of this too. And now she had the paperwork in front of her and she was really concerned about it. So she picked up the phone and called her friend, Alice Hamilton, who was one of the leading, pioneers in industrial toxicology. She was a physician and a scientist. And Alice Hamilton, I actually, Dr. Clapp and I were talking earlier today and before the show started, and Jane Addams, who had Hull House, we've all heard about Jane Addams in our history books and the work that she did around social work and social consciousness. And Alice Hamilton had been a part of Jane's work. And so she had been visiting these sites and had been seeing what was happening with the workers. She was very concerned about that. And she realized that there had been this report and when Ginny and I were making the movie, there was always a reference to the drinker report. And well, Ginny, why don't you talk about when we sort of dug deeper into the research about the drinker report?
Right. So the drinker report is this pivotal piece of evidence in the Radium Girls case, because US Radium commissioned a report by two leading experts in industrial hygiene, the drinkers, Cecil and Kathryn, at Harvard. Yes, Harvard. And so they went to the radium factory and they conducted a report, and they did find that there were issues. However, the report there's a lot in there, but the overview is that they filed a report with the New Jersey Health Department that said everything was fine. So the
company filed that report.
Right. The company submitted this report in under the drinker's name. And so Alice Hamilton, after being contacted by Kathryn Wiley, who Hamilton had been her mentor for some time, wrote to Dr. Kathryn Drinker and said, did you know that they filed a report in your name? Because part of what happened when they conducted the study was that the drinkers were not allowed to release the study. And it was a pretty, pivotal finding for them in the field. And they weren't allowed to release it under threat of lawsuit. And so in this sort of key moment where it all came together was Hamilton writing to Kathryn Drinker and saying, there's a falsified report, and that was and there's this like really beautiful letter back from Dr. Drinker to Alice Hamilton saying, I think she said something like, if he really did that, then that would make him a real villain, which I think is an understatement, but it's pretty accurate.
And the letter is in the Library of Congress. So all of these documents it was amazing to kind of really research and find them and see them and kind of, just experience the conversation that was happening between two very prominent, scientists who happened to be women in that time period. And they were really connected to a lot of other activist women. And when you mentioned the early women's political movement, there was the League of Women Voters. There were a lot of women who had worked very hard to get the right to vote, not that long before the story. And there was a lot of, really Wild West kind of energy around industrialization and very little regulation. And women were very much a part of the forefront of legislating and organizing around that. So when the Radium Girls were clear that they were ready to stand up against the corporation, there were all these other sort of prominent activist women who really lifted them up and elevated their story to a national level. They were also very connected with the media, and Walter Lippmann and a lot of important media people really also rallied in to really what it made. So when Ginny and I finished the movie and we were premiering at Tribeca Film Festival, we invited Betsy Sutherland to come speak with us on the stage because she had left the EPA. She was the former director of water and science and technology at the EPA. She had left because she was, I think, feeling like she could be more effective outside of the government than within the government. But she told us right away that people at the EPA were very excited about our movie because they used the Radium Girls case all the time in litigating toxic regulation cases. And I was, how could they still be looking at, as Ginny and I have gone further and later, the contamination is it's still there. These EPA Superfund sites, and Dr. Clapp and I were clocking when the EPA was founded. I mean, it really started in the 70s.
Yeah.
And that's when radium was finally banned. But all the contamination, I mean, when the factories were taken down, the waste that was put into landfill, they poured concrete into sidewalks, they built housing foundations with all of this material that was toxic. And so the EPA Superfund sites have really had massive, massive jobs to try to clean up the contamination. And to a certain extent, sometimes it can happen and sometimes not as much.
Yeah, and the postscript of the film it's certainly eye-opening when it talks about, this wasn't something that just ended in the 20s and that was that. I guess, one of my closing questions would be sort of what can we do as citizens, and this is for any of you, I know Dr. Clapp, you're involved, to be aware and to advocate for environmental health and, regulation of these toxic chemicals.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, there are social movements that pressure agencies. I think you mentioned that, how does this relate to EPA now? Well, in January, we're going to have a new head of the EPA and a new head of the U.S. Department of Labor and therefore OSHA. And so workers' organizations, so-called COSH groups, and then environmental organizations are going to be what pushes those agencies to do their jobs much better than has been the case the last 4 years. We had a very good run during the Obama administration with really excellent EPA administrators and a really excellent and the longest serving director of OSHA that we've ever had. And they made some headway. And so now we got to get back to that.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the parallels with COVID now, because there's so many, and journalists were really picking up on this as they were starting to see the film and we were starting to talk about it, that, there's so many parallels with this element that you don't know that much about, or this virus you don't know everything about, and so much misinformation, disinformation, denial of science, world economies collapsing, or in our case, big city economies collapsing, and people getting sick and dying, and then asking if it's safe to go back to work. It's
right.
It's really interesting, because I think what we hope comes out of the movie is for people not to just sort of look down about things that you can't control or you don't think you can control, and to sort of see, and maybe it's the time now, because we've seen we've just gone through an election where you really see that your voice matters. Your voice does matter and your vote counts. And so there is a potential power that maybe we've just been too complacent about for too long, that we need to sort of stand up and think about what are all the things that we really need to raise our voices about.
Yeah, no, and I think with this story, you've brought the humanity blazing forth in these girls, and you really have. It's an inspiring film, I think, in so many ways. I think from when you think back to the story itself, it seems like, okay, well, people who know them and know their fate, obviously that's very a tragic thing. But I think just these women the story of these women coming together, and as you said, Bessie with her hopes and dreams, and you see her evolution from this very sort of bubbly and hopeful character to she's changed by the end of the film. So I would just congratulate you both on just these brilliant female characters that you brought blazing to life. I don't know if you have thoughts about that you want to share, or any closing thoughts.
I mean, yeah, I'll just say that there are so many stories that we just haven't. I feel like there are stories like this that I thought didn't exist just because they weren't in, the state or even like college level history textbooks, or if they are, they're in the footnotes and in the margins. And I think that something that's so exciting is just is looking there and then telling those stories, because so many of the stories that have been told are, women without voices or women whose stories are distorted. And that's what the Radium Company tried to do to them in their time. They, time and time again, they said, oh, they diagnosed them with syphilis. They said, one of the stories, which is just, they said, oh, they were sick before they came to work here, and we're so nice for employing sick workers, and now they're taking advantage of us. And so I think that in their time, and like certainly still today, it's like the ways in which stories are especially like women's stories are distorted, and the ways that we can tell them with some perspective and force, I think is exciting.
Yeah. And our social impact campaign is sort of designed to encompass science and female empowerment, and also environmental justice and women's history. And we, one of our partners is the Gina Davis Institute of Gender and Media, and they have a mantra that is, if she can see it, she can be it. And so the idea of encouraging women to really pursue careers in science is very important, as we all know. And it's exciting to use, our work around the story in that way as well, because it's about women using their voice, but it's also about creating greater awareness for science all around, because it's just been too striking in these last so many years that science can be denied, and that we need to have these conversations. We need to talk about it more openly, and it may not always be things that we want to hear, but they may be things that we need to hear and we need to talk about. So so I think that's also one of our goals with the social impact campaign.
Yeah, no, and Sloan, I think, has done incredible work in that field with funding films like yours and other scripts and projects like this. Can we get a website or a link to share with everyone for your social impact campaign? Do they go to radiumgirlsmovie.com or?
Yes, radiumgirlsmovie.com. We're working on our partnership with the Sierra Club right now, who has a lot of calls to action that we're going to be getting behind and supporting, and asking all of our partners to join with us.
Yeah, it's such a crucial issue, and unfortunately it's an ongoing issue. So encourage people to check that out. And if you know somebody who's looking for an amazing film, an amazing story, please steer them to watching Radium Girls on Coolidge.org or at their local art house theaters. You guys, I think, are playing in some theaters that are open. We unfortunately are not open at the moment, but you're doing virtual screening rooms, which we really appreciate that we can bring this to our audiences who are still at home, but with the help of science, hopefully not for much longer. So thank you all for joining us. I'm really thrilled to have you, and have a good evening, everyone.
Okay.
Pleasure.